I want to tell you that I'm living out a dream by standing in front of you and telling a story that's been in my mind for a few years now. And so I'll give the acknowledgement up front and saying thank you for the opportunity to share this with you, and thank you all for being here. It was December 6, 2008. I just finished the last session of a meeting that had brought myself, my wife Jennifer, our children, 7-year-old Nate, 3-year-old Sophie, and my mother-in-law Linda to majestic Vienna, Austria during the Christmas season. My business now complete, and this was the time to enjoy. We are off to enjoy Christmas time in Vienna. The next day, we were off to the Alps for 3 unforgettable days of skiing, or so we thought. And while the next 3 days were indeed unforgettable, they did not at all turn out the way we had anticipated. So that evening, we stepped out of our hotel onto the Ringstrasse, for anyone who's ever been in Vienna, soaking in the atmosphere, the chill of the air, the excitement of the holiday season. I had taken Tylenol a few minutes earlier and was just starting to ease the headache that had plagued me really all that day, and as I thought about it, in retrospect, for a few months. We wandered through these streets, soaking up the atmosphere in and out of shops, and ultimately arrived at the flagship Swarovski store. We climbed the stairs to the second floor, and gazing at the beautiful jewelry, my daughter, Sophie, was on my shoulders, as she was through most of that trip, to stay out of the crowds and to get a better view. For some reason, and I don't understand the reason still to this day, I felt the urgent need to get her off my shoulders and to get her back on firm ground. Immediately upon doing just that, the sounds of that crowded store went silent, and my world faded to black. That's the last that I remember of that excursion that evening. And what I'm going to tell you now, I only know through the voices of my children, through the voice of my wife. And what's amazing to me is now, almost 3 years later, how vividly those memories are etched in the mind of my now 10-year-old son. I'm going to share with you what he wrote about his experience that night. "Help! Help!" my mom and grandma said. I looked down. My dad was laying down unconscious. "Is he dead?" "Help!" I yelled. By now the clerk was on the phone with the dispatcher. "We need an ambulance now." It seemed like hours before the ambulance got there. And we started to leave. It took us 5 minutes to get out of the store. Then my dad was wheeled out of the store on a gurney. It was a sad moment. By now at least 300 people were watching us. I was embarrassed. There was a lot of police. It was scary. The police took us back to the hotel, and they were driving like it was a murder. I wondered why the lights were on, sirens on. They went the wrong way on the street. Then they drove on the streetcar tracks. When we got back to the hotel, my mom went to the front desk. We went to sit on the couch. That night, we ordered room service. I got the hamburger that I loved, but I couldn't eat it. I was sad to look in the other room and see it was empty. No mom, no dad. Later, we found out that he had brain cancer. I was sad. As I lay unconscious on the floor of the Swarovski store, my wife of 9 years, Jennifer, a nurse by training, looked at me wondering what was happening to me. She watched as my lips turned blue, and I struggled for breath. Out of the crowd stepped a man and a woman, a husband and wife, who identified themselves as physicians and knelt down beside her. They told her I was having a seizure, and they rolled me on my side so that I could breathe. And what must have seemed like an eternity for my family, the 5 to 10 minutes it took for the seizure to stop and the ambulance to arrive, upon arrival of the medical personnel, those angels, as my wife described them, faded back into the crowd, never to be seen again. I'm told that as I regained consciousness, I tried to stand and was falling. I have no recollection of this, but as I stumbled about the room, my wife was sure that I would fall into one of the many glass cases in the room, further injuring myself. The medical personnel didn't understand. They didn't see the seizure. Was I under the influence of drugs, alcohol? They were very suspicious and didn't believe my wife when she said that I had had a seizure. The police finally ordered me to sit, and thank God I did, so that I didn't injure myself. As Nate said, the police then took me to the emergency room and my family back to our hotel. When my wife got back to the hotel, she was desperate for help. She's not one to usually ask for help, but on that night, she was desperate to find someone, anyone, who might be able to help her. The front desk staff was very helpful and started calling members of the group I had been traveling with, trying to find someone who might be in their room, but everyone they called were, as we had been out enjoying their last evening in Vienna as well. Fortunately for us, Bert Kasiski, a physician from Minneapolis, was in his room settling in for his early flight the next morning. Jennifer left our kids with her mom at the hotel, and together, she and Bert set off for the hospital where I had been taken. My first memory, after my world had gone black and silent, was the sound of a siren. Not the siren that I was used to hearing, but that siren that I had heard on TV and movies, that European type of siren. I was in the back of an ambulance with absolutely no idea what had happened to me. It was dark outside. The words being spoken by the people caring for me, I didn't understand. My next memory, I'm in the emergency room. Beside me is my wife with Bert. I hear Bert speaking fluent German to the attending physician. See, Bert had spent a year in Germany during his medical training. I learned just this year that it was Bert who insisted that I have a CT scan of my brain when he learned that they planned to discharge me that evening. I don't remember going in the CT scanner, but I vividly recall being taken from the CT scanner directly into the MRI. I was 35 years old. I'd never had a seizure before. This was my first one, and now I'm in an MRI scanner. I knew I had a brain tumor. My medical training, as good or as bad as it might be, was right on. Being in the MRI scanner only confirmed that diagnosis, and suddenly, like a splash of cold water to my face, the realization that my life could be over was so very real. How long had the tumor been there? How fast was it growing? What could we do about it? What about my wife? What about my kids? Brain tumors aren't good. I'm gonna die. It became very clear during the 6 days that I spent in the hospital that the goal of care in Vienna was really just to stabilize me so that I could go home. So as we struggled, knowing I had a brain tumor, knowing that there was absolutely nothing anyone in that hospital could do for that, back home, people sprung into action on our behalf. Jennifer's sister, my wife Jennifer's sister, Melinda, made the flight arrangements that would take Jennifer, my children, and her mom from Vienna to Munich to catch our originally scheduled flights the next Thursday. She booked flights for my brother, Todd, a paramedic. He drove from northern Indiana to Chicago the Wednesday after my seizure to get his passport, then drove to Columbus the next day and set off for his first trip overseas to come and get me. For nearly 36 hours, I was alone in Vienna as my wife and my family traveled home and my brother came to me. The days before had really been marked by fear, anger, frustration. I wasn't even 36 yet. With all I had been through, I couldn't imagine that this is the way it was all going to end for me. But on that Thursday, all of those voices of fear, of anger, of doubt were finally silent for me. And I was overwhelmed by a feeling of gratitude. I was so thankful for the life I had been able to live, for the memories I had been able to make, and the faces of those people who had been so important to me kept flashing in my mind. I hoped that they knew how important they had been to me and all that I had achieved and all that I was able to achieve. I thought about how impossible it all seemed, and I was then struck by the realization that this feeling of overwhelming gratitude wasn't a new one for me. I'd felt this before in what seemed like another lifetime to me. The year was 1993. I lived in this apartment building in Indianapolis, Indiana. I was a junior at Butler University. I had been on dialysis for just over a year at that point. That night, laying in my apartment, hooked up to the dialysis machine that kept me alive, I was overwhelmed by the generosity of so many people People had played such an important role in rallying around me when illness tried to claim control of my life. They supported me and nurtured me. I thought of Lowell. Lowell was a local businessman in my hometown of Wabash, Indiana. I worked for him for one summer, and at the time had no idea how profoundly he would impact my life. The people of my community raised money for me to help cover my expenses as I continued to get treatments, as I continued to pursue an education, holding on to my dream of someday becoming a physician. There were my moms. These were the dialysis nurses that I saw almost every week for the 2.5 years I spent on dialysis. Yes, they were paid to care for me, but they cared about me. They loved me, they encouraged me, they nurtured me. They were so important to me. There was Dr. Mo. She was a nephrologist at IU who had arranged for me to meet with the head of the medical school admissions committee, and I learned later that it was those conversations, that relationship with him, that ended up being key for me ever achieving my dream of becoming a physician and getting into medical school in the first place. There was Dr. Milgram, a surgeon. He had been the one who insisted that he perform the last 4 of 7 operations I had had in the preceding 2 years. At the end of every operation, he would come into my room that evening, sit on the end of my bed, and encourage me. Those people had meant so much to me, and I wanted them to know how much their impact had made on my life. I swore to myself that day in Vienna that I would thank them. If I survived and I could find them, I would thank them for all they had meant to me. Now, 15 years later in Vienna, my future, again, completely uncertain and unclear. I realized I had been so wrapped up in life since 1993 that I had forgotten about how important people had been in my life. It made me angry to think that I could have gone through that and gotten so caught up in achieving the next thing, getting to the next step in my life, that I would forget that. There was one person, though, more than any, who had profoundly impacted my life. I met Sheila. I didn't know her name at the time. She didn't have a face, didn't have a name, and Sheila, I learned later, was her name. On January 25th, 1995, I received one of Sheila's kidneys. I don't know how she died. I only know she was 39 years old when she died. That's 1 year older than I am now. Her gift to me had changed the course of my life. Without that gift, I wouldn't have gone to medical school, most likely. I wouldn't have met my wife. I wouldn't have my kids. All of those memories I can trace back to that one day in 1995. That decision made by her family that she would be an organ donor, made in a time of unimaginable grief, had completely changed the trajectory of my life. They needed to know about the beautiful life I had been able to have thanks to her gift. I needed them to know. And whether I survived or didn't survive, they were going to know about that. I don't really believe in coincidence. I need to state that for the record. I don't think coincidence can explain the angels in the Swarovski store or Bert's fluency in German that night in the emergency room. Can't explain all of those people who had been so important in my life in 1993 and during that time on dialysis. And it certainly can't explain what happened when I got back from Vienna. 10 days after the seizure, I was admitted to OSU Medical Center, and the feeling was that my tumor represented a form of lymphoma seen only in transplant patients. And the irony of it all, the cruel irony, is that while I took powerful medications to prevent my body from rejecting the organ I had received 13 years before, those same medications kept my body from recognizing the cancerous cells and eliminating them, allowing a tumor to form in the first place. My oncologist was hopeful that they would have a therapy to offer me, and on Christmas Eve 2008, we got the official diagnosis of EBV-associated post-transplant lymphoma. The staff at OSU Medical Center had allowed my children to come and decorate my room. Even a small Christmas tree. Nate and Sophie wrote their letters to Santa and asked him to deliver their presents to Rhodes Hall. And we celebrated Christmas that year with hope. You see, this type of lymphoma typically carries an average survival of about 2 to 12 months and a survival of less than 10% in most centers across the country and around the world. It's hardly coincidence that 8 years previous to that time, we had moved to Columbus, Ohio, where Dr. Michael Caligiuri and his colleagues, including Dr. Baiocchi, my oncologist, had developed an experimental therapy that had shown promise for specifically this type of lymphoma, promise in the 6 patients they had treated before me. He was very optimistic that this therapy would work. 3 weeks after starting therapy, the tumor that had been the size of a walnut right here, the tumor that had caused the tragedy in Austria was gone. And within 6 months, I had no evidence of active disease at all. I was in remission. It's miraculous. It's impossible that that could happen that way. It was simply amazing to me, and I would love to tell you that the story ends there. But that's not the case. 1 year after our tragedy in Austria, the kidney that I had received almost 15 years earlier failed, and I was again back on dialysis. I was devastated, frankly, to be back on dialysis, and it was my wife who helped me put it in perspective when she said, "A year ago, I thought you were going to die. We'll do whatever it takes. We'll take what we get." And so for 15 months, my wife and I performed daily hemodialysis in our home, our last treatment being this past August 1st, after which we again went back to OSU Medical Center, this time for a second kidney transplant. My cousin Heidi is a police officer in suburban Seattle, and I got a surprise phone call from her last May telling me she was a match, and she was coming to Columbus to complete testing. She wanted to give me one of her kidneys, and on August 2nd, that's what she did. What do you say to somebody who offers you and gives you a part of their own body? I finally learned, after all I've been through, that when you're grateful for something, you simply say thank you. Saying thank you is simple. It's effective. You don't need a platform like the one I've been fortunate to have today. You don't need grandiose gestures. You simply have to recognize and realize that people have influenced your own life. Identify who those people are, reach out to them, and thank them. A card, an email, a letter, a face-to-face visit, to let them know what they've meant to you and what their efforts meant to you. I was able to go back and find those people I swore in Vienna that I would thank, and I thanked every one of them. And the only reason I know Sheila's name is because of the contact I had with her family. We live in a society that celebrates individual accomplishment, and the truth is nobody has ever accomplished anything in this world without the help and input of others. I've sworn to myself that I will treasure the memories, treasure each day, try not to get so caught up in the day-to-day challenges and thinking so far ahead that I ignore what's right in front of my face, as I had made that mistake earlier in my life. I try to remember that the memories are the important part of life. The relationships are the important part of life. I hope that by hearing my story, that you all realize that there have been so many people who have played a significant role in your own life. They didn't care about you because they had to. They cared because they chose to. We all have a tapestry made up of the faces of those many people who cared for us along the way. I hope that if you think about it, you can identify who some of those people have been for you. My challenge to you is that you reach out to them, that you let them know what their influence, their input, their caring has meant to you. Don't put it off because you have too much to do, you think there's no time. Don't put it off until tomorrow, because my life clearly illustrates that tomorrow is never guaranteed. I'm grateful to these people and so many more that I may never see again. I encourage you, please, to reach out to those who have influenced you and influenced your life so richly. I'm thankful that you're all here today, and I'm grateful to Ruth and to everyone for giving me the opportunity to share this life I've been blessed to have. Thank you.
So I asked Trent to stay here for a second because I have a little story. During rehearsals on Wednesday, another speaker, I should say that all the speakers have amazing interconnections they didn't know they had before this event. And hopefully you've seen them from your seats and created your own connections with them. But during rehearsals on Wednesday, another speaker came in. She started to prepare her talk, and she looked at Trent, and she said, "I didn't know he survived." Because Claudia was one of the radiologists that read his scans 3 years ago. So that is a coincidence?
I don't think so.
So thank you.